The first time Nora Kendrick threw a bucket of well water on a man who wouldn't take no for an answer, the whole town of Dusty Creek, Texas decided she was the most difficult woman west of the Mississippi, and they weren't entirely wrong about that. But they weren't entirely right either. It was the summer of 1882, and Dusty Creek sat baking under a sun so relentless that the wooden boardwalks had begun to crack and curl at their edges like the pages of an old Bible. The town had grown up around a railhead and a cattle route, and it carried within its dusty veins all the contradictions of the frontier men who were equal parts brave and cruel, women who were equal parts strong and invisible, and a law that bent itself conveniently toward whoever had the most money or the most bullets. Nora Kendrick had neither of those things, but what she had was a tongue sharpened by years of navigating a world that had never once made space for her. She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair that she wore pinned up in a practical knot at the back of her neck, and eyes the color of creek water after a heavy rain, green and brown and shifting, depending on the light. She was not small. She stood at a height that made smaller men nervous and larger men curious, and her hands were the hands of someone who had worked every single day of her life. She owned the only seamstress shop in Dusty Creek, a narrow little building wedged between the general store and a leather goods shop run by a man named Harold Fenwick, who never once greeted her without a comment about how she ought to be married by now. She had heard that particular observation so many times that she had composed 17 different responses to it in her head, ranging from politely dismissive to scorched earth. Her father, Thomas Kendrick, had died when she was 19, leaving her the shop and a small house on the edge of town, and a reputation for having raised the most stubborn creature God had ever placed on Texas soil. Her mother had passed when Nora was 7, and her father had done his best, which meant she had grown up largely on her own terms, reading every book that came through the general store, learning to manage the shop, learning to manage money, and learning, above all else, that no one was going to give her an inch of anything unless she took it herself. The women in town found her exhausting. The men in town found her intimidating. The children in town adored her, because she was the only adult in Dusty Creek who talked to them as though they were people. Mrs. Caldwell, the preacher's wife, had once told her directly that a woman with opinions was a woman with problems, and Nora had smiled her very sweetest smile and said that she would rather have problems than be empty, and the two of them had not shared a civil word since. She was, in short, the kind of woman who made small people feel smaller, not out of cruelty, but simply by existing fully and without apology. And in Dusty Creek in 1882, that was enough to earn you a reputation. The day Peter Garrison rode into town was a Wednesday in late July, when the heat had settled so completely over the land that even the flies seemed reluctant to move. Nora was standing outside her shop, pinning up a new display in the window, when she heard the particular sound of a horse that had been ridden hard, and was being ridden harder, a sound she knew well from the cattle drives that moved through town twice a year. She looked up. He came down the main street at a controlled canter, which was itself unusual, because men who rode into Dusty Creek at that pace were either in a measured hurry or knew exactly what they were doing. He was tall in the saddle, genuinely tall, not the manufactured height some men achieved by sitting too straight. He wore a brown leather vest over a white shirt that had seen better days, and a hat pulled low against the sun, and the kind of jaw that Nora's friend and only real confidant, a woman named Mee Briggs who ran the town's only boarding house, would have called a painting come to life. Nora was not interested in jaws. She went back to her window display. It took approximately 4 hours for the whole town to know who he was and where he had come from. This was the nature of Dusty Creek. Peter Garrison was 30 years old, a former ranch hand from the Panhandle, who had spent the last several years doing contract work for cattle ranchers up and down the territory, breaking horses, moving herds, doing the kind of physical labor that required a combination of strength and intelligence that not every man possessed. He had come to Dusty Creek because a man named Curtis Webb, who owned the largest ranch outside of town, had sent word through a trail agent that he needed a foreman. Someone reliable, someone who knew cattle and men and could handle both without drama. Curtis Webb was 62 years old and ailing, and his ranch, the Double W, was the economic backbone of the entire region. He had 3 adult sons, none of whom had the slightest inclination toward honest work, and he had been desperately searching for someone to manage his operations for the better part of a year. He had gone through 2 foremen already, one who drank, and one who turned out to have been quietly stealing from him, and he needed this one to stick. Peter Garrison was not a man who told stories about himself. He came into Dusty Creek, secured a room at Me Briggs's boarding house, ate a quiet supper, and rode out to the Double W the following morning. Me, who knew everything about everyone, told Nora over coffee that he was polite, that he said please and thank you, that he had paid for a full month in advance, and that he had a copy of a Shakespeare play in his saddlebag alongside his working tools. Shakespeare, Nora repeated flatly. I saw it myself, Me said. He said it right on the dresser. That doesn't mean he reads it. It doesn't mean he doesn't, Me said, with the particular tone of someone who had already made up her mind about something and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Nora finished her coffee and went back to work. She might have continued to have no opinion whatsoever about Peter Garrison if it hadn't been for the incident with Roy Hale. Roy Hale was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, reasonably handsome by the standards of Dusty Creek, and absolutely convinced that Nora Kendrick was going to be his wife. He had been convinced of this for 3 years, during which time Nora had declined his proposals. There had been 4 of them with increasing clarity and, she felt, remarkable patience. Roy Hale was not a bad man. He was not a cruel man. He was, however, a man who had confused persistence with devotion and who genuinely could not comprehend that a woman might simply not want him. He came into her shop on a Thursday afternoon in August, 3 weeks after Peter Garrison had arrived in Dusty Creek. He arrived with flowers, wildflowers he had picked himself, which Nora actually found touching despite her irritation, and the expression of a man who had decided that today was the day. Nora, he said, setting the flowers on her counter without asking, I have been thinking. Roy, she said, without looking up from the shirt she was mending, whatever you have been thinking, the answer is still no. You haven't heard what I have to say. I have heard every version of what you have to say. My answer has not changed. He leaned against the counter. You're going to be alone forever if you keep on like this. She set down her needle. She looked at him directly. She had brown-green eyes, and when she was angry they went more green than brown, and right now they were very green indeed. Roy, she said, I would rather spend the rest of my days completely alone than spend one single morning married to a man I chose out of fear of loneliness. That is not an insult to you. It is simply the truth. Roy Hale's face went through several colors. You are the most difficult woman I have ever known in my entire life. Yes, she said, I have been told. Doesn't it bother you, being like this? Not even a little, she said, and picked up her needle. He left, taking the wildflowers with him, and Nora sat for a moment in the particular kind of quiet that followed scenes like that, scenes she had been having her entire life, in varying versions with varying men, and always arriving at the same conclusion. She was difficult. She had been told so by her father's friends, by the women at church, by every man who had ever wanted something from her that she wasn't prepared to give. She had decided somewhere around the age of 22 that if being yourself made you difficult, then difficult was simply what you were. She was thinking this exact thought when the shop door opened again, and she looked up with the full intention of telling Roy Hale, in very clear terms, that she was done with this conversation for the day and potentially for this calendar year. It was not Roy Hale. Peter Garrison stood in the doorway of her shop with a torn shirt in his hand and the mild expression of a man who had absolutely no idea he had just walked into anything charged. He was taller than she'd registered from the street. He had to angle his hat slightly as he came through the door, and he had the look of someone who had spent the morning working hard in the heat. There was dust on his boots and a redness at the back of his neck from the sun, and his eyes, she noticed despite herself, were an unusual shade of gray-brown that reminded her of driftwood. "Pardon me," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, the way certain rivers moved without urgency but with direction. "I was told this was the only seamstress in town." "It is," she said. "I have a shirt that needs mending. I'd pay well for it." She looked at the shirt. It had a significant tear along the left side seam, the kind of tear that happened when you reach too hard and too fast for something. "I can fix that," she said. "Come back in 2 days. I appreciate it." He set the shirt on the counter and reached into his vest pocket for coins. "Will $1 do? 50 cents is the going rate." $1 is what I'm offering. 50 cents is what I'm charging," she said. He looked at her then. Not with irritation, not with the bewilderment she was used to seeing when she declined to accept what people offered her, something more like recognition. The very corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. 50 cents then, he said, and left the exact amount on the counter. He turned to go and she said, and she was not entirely sure why she said it except that the afternoon had already been strange and something in her was still unsettled from Roy Hale's visit. "They were wrong, by the way." He stopped, turned back. "Pardon. Whatever they said to you that made you offer more money than necessary to compensate for some expectation of rudeness. They were wrong. I'm not rude. I'm direct. Those are not the same thing." He studied her for a moment with those driftwood eyes. "I wasn't offering more because I expected rudeness," he said. "I was offering more because you're running a business and your rate seems lower than your skill." She blinked. That was not the answer she had expected. "Come back in 2 days," she said again, because she didn't have an immediate response to that, and Peter Garrison nodded and left, and Nora Kendrick sat in her quiet shop with the torn shirt in front of her, and something she hadn't felt in a very long time stirring somewhere behind her ribs. She told herself it was indigestion. He came back in 2 days as requested, and she had the shirt mended. She had done a clean, strong repair along that seam, reinforced with double stitching the way she did for men whose work was physical and who needed things to last. He examined it carefully when she handed it over, running a thumb along the seam line, and she watched his face and saw genuine appreciation, the kind that wasn't performed. "This is quality work," he said. "I know," she said. He paid her 50 cents and then paused at the door. "I'm Peter Garrison. I'm the new foreman out at the W. I know who you are," she said. "Dusty Creek is not a large town." "I'm aware," he said. "And you're Miss Kendrick." "Nora," she said, and then was mildly surprised that she had said it. "Nora," he repeated, as though he were testing the shape of it. "I'll likely need more mending done. The work is hard on clothes." "I expect it is." "I'll see you next time, then." He said it like it was a simple fact, not a question or a request. He left, and me Briggs, who had apparently been browsing fabric at the back of the shop for a suspiciously long time, emerged from between 2 bolts of calico with an expression that Nora found deeply annoying. "Not a word," Nora said. "I wasn't going to say anything," me said, in a tone that very clearly meant she was absolutely going to say something. The next several weeks passed in the way that things pass when you are trying to convince yourself you aren't paying attention to something. Nora's shop was on the main street, and the main street was the route Peter Garrison took when he rode in from the W, and she became aware, without meaning to, with a certain amount of self-directed irritation, that she could identify the sound of his horse at a distance. He had a bay gelding he called Cass, and the horse moved with a distinctive, even rhythm that was different from the other horses in town. He came to the shop twice more in August, once with a pair of work pants that had blown out at the knee, and once with a vest that had lost 2 buttons. Each time he was precise about what he needed, paid without argument at the rate she set, and spent a small amount of time talking to her about something entirely unrelated to the mending. The first time, it was the water situation at the W. There was a dispute between Curtis Webb and the neighboring rancher about a creek that ran between their properties, and he spoke about it with the kind of analytical clarity that made Nora realize he was not simply a man who moved cattle. The second time, she had a book open on the counter beside her work. She always had a book open. It was one of her habits that people found peculiar, and it was a collection of natural history essays, and he had looked at it and said that he had read something by the same author the previous winter. She had been so startled that she had looked up too fast and nearly stabbed herself with her needle. "You've read Thomas Huxley," she said. "Found a copy in a bunkhouse in Abilene about 4 years ago," he said. "Left by some other hand who'd moved on. I read it twice. What did you make of it?" He considered this with genuine seriousness. "I thought he was right about more things than he was comfortable admitting," he said. Nora had many opinions about Thomas Huxley, and she expressed several of them, and he listened with the kind of attention that she was not at all accustomed to from men in conversation, the kind of attention that actually engaged rather than simply waited for its own turn to speak. He disagreed with one of her points, and he told her exactly why, and it was a good reason, and she told him it was a good reason, and he left with his rebuttoned vest, and she sat for 20 minutes after not doing any work at all. She acknowledged to herself privately, paying attention to Peter Garrison. This was inconvenient. It was me who forced the situation forward, as me generally did with anything that required a push. September had come to Dusty Creek, bringing a slight easing of the heat and the annual harvest dance that the town held in the open space behind the church. Nora went every year because she enjoyed dancing, which was one of the few things she and Mrs. Caldwell agreed upon, and because me always went, and because it was one of the few social events where the town actually felt, briefly, like a community rather than a collection of individuals all angled against each other. Me had, in what was a masterpiece of casual manipulation, managed to seat herself and Nora at the same long table as Peter Garrison, who had come to the dance with Curtis Webb's approval, and a look on his face that suggested he was comfortable at such events but did not seek them out. He was, Nora noted, a very good dancer. This was not something she had anticipated. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had learned early and practiced often, and when he asked her to dance, the second dance of the evening, after she had observed him for the full duration of the first, he asked as though he expected she might say yes or might say no, and either answer would be received with equal composure. She said yes. They danced a reel, which required too much quick movement for conversation, and then a slower waltz afterward, which did not have that excuse. She was aware of the warmth of his hand at her back, and the way he maintained a proper, respectful distance, while somehow still making her feel entirely partnered rather than adjacent. "You're a good dancer," she said, because it was true. "My mother taught me," he said. "She said a man who couldn't dance was only half civilized. She sounds like a practical woman." She was the most practical woman I've ever known. Something moved through his expression. "She passed 4 years ago." "I'm sorry," Nora said, and meant it. "Were you close with your parents?" he asked. "My father and I were close," she said. "My mother died when I was 7. My father raised me mostly on his own. He was a good man, but he had no idea what to do with me." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I came out opinionated," she said, "and he had expected something quieter. He loved me, but he spent most of my childhood looking slightly bewildered by what he had produced." Peter laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, and the sound of it did something entirely unfair to the state of Nora's composure. "He must have been proud of you," he said. "He told me once right before he died that I was the best and most exhausting thing that had ever happened to him," she said. "I count that as a compliment." "It absolutely is," Peter said. The waltz ended. They stood for a moment in the particular space that follows a dance, where the music has stopped but the moment has not quite concluded, and Nora Kendrick, who was not a woman given to hesitation, found herself hesitating. "Would you like to get some air?" he asked. They walked to the edge of the churchyard, where a low fence divided the social space from the open scrubland beyond, and the stars above the Texas Panhandle were thick and brilliant in the way they only ever got this far from anything that could be called a city. She had always loved the stars over Dusty Creek. It was one of the few things she loved unconditionally about the place. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "In Dusty Creek. My whole life," she said. "My parents settled here in '63. I've never lived anywhere else. Does that suit you?" "Sometimes," she said honestly, "and sometimes I feel like the edges of this town are walls." He nodded. He understood that she could see, not because it had been said to him before, but because he understood it from his own experience of walls in different shapes. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "There are bigger ranches, richer men than Curtis Webb." "Webb offered me something the bigger ranches didn't," he said. "What was that?" "Autonomy," he said. "Wants someone to run things properly, and he doesn't want to have to approve every single decision. Some men in his position can't let go of the details even when they don't have the strength for them anymore. He can. I respect that." "He's a decent man," Nora said. "Better than most who have that kind of land and money." "He is," Peter agreed. "His sons are a problem." She glanced at him. "That's a frank thing to say. You seem to appreciate frankness." "I do," she said. "Very much." He turned slightly toward her, and in the starlight his face was all quiet shadows and those strange gray-brown eyes. "I've been told I'm too blunt," he said. "By whom?" "Most people. Most people find bluntness uncomfortable because it removes the comfortable distance between what is said and what is meant," she said. "I find that distance exhausting." "So do I," he said. They looked at each other in the way that people sometimes do when they recognize something in another person that they had stopped expecting to find. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no thunder, no sweeping wind. It was quiet and specific and entirely certain, and Nora felt it land somewhere very deep in her chest. She went home that night and told me, who was walking with her because they always walked home from the harvest dance together, that she had a problem. "You like him," Me said immediately. "That is an oversimplification." "It's also true," Me said. I have a life that works. I have a shop that pays my way. I have never been the kind of woman who what?" Me said with great gentleness. "Who deserves to be loved, because that is what you were about to say, and I will not let you finish it." Nora was quiet for a full block. "He said something to me tonight," she said finally. "He said I seemed to appreciate frankness. Not as an observation, not as a criticism, as though it were a quality." "Because it is," Me said. "No one has ever," she stopped. "People have spent my entire life trying to soften me down or sand me away, and he just said it like it was a simple thing." "Because to him it is," Me said. They reached Nora's house, which was small and neat and full of books and fabric and the evidence of a woman who had built a complete life for herself, and Me hugged her at the gate and went on down the street, and Nora stood alone under the brilliant Texas stars for a long moment before going inside. She lay in the dark for a long time that night, listening to the faint sounds of the town settling around her, and she let herself feel the thing she had been very carefully not feeling, and it was considerable. October came to Dusty Creek on the back of a cold front that pushed down from the north and rattled the shutters and drove everyone indoors by evening. The work at the Double W was intensifying as Webb prepared for the late-year cattle drive to Abilene, and Nora saw Peter less frequently during the week, but the pattern they had established continued. He would come to the shop when he had work for her. They would talk, and occasionally, when the afternoon allowed it and there was no pressure of schedule, those conversations stretched to an hour or more. She learned, in this way, a great deal about him. He had grown up in Central Texas, the second of 3 sons, his father a blacksmith and his mother a schoolteacher who had carried her love of books from the small Georgia town she'd grown up in all the way west. He had started working on ranches at 15, not out of necessity, but out of a genuine draw toward the land and the work, a preference for the open sky over any closed ceiling. He had a brother in New Mexico and another who had gone to California, and with whom he had lost contact, and there was a careful, measured grief in the way he spoke about that last one that told Nora it was something still raw at the edges. He learned things about her too. He was a good asker of questions, which was rare, and a good listener, which was rarer still. She told him about her father's shop and how she had learned to sew because her father had taught her the basics, and she had simply gone further with it because she found precision satisfying. She told him about the books she ordered through the general store, how Mr. Hobson, who ran the store, had started setting them aside for her when new shipments came in because otherwise they would sell before she had a chance at them. She told him about the 7 years she had spent after her father's death building the shop from a struggling little concern into something that actually turned a decent profit. And she told him about Roy Hale, which was perhaps more candid than was strictly necessary. But it felt important to be honest about who she was and what her life in this town had looked like. Peter had listened to the Roy Hale situation with his characteristic stillness and then said, "He called you difficult." "Many people have," she said. "It's something of a running theme." "What do you think it means?" he asked. "When someone calls you difficult," she paused. "I think it usually means I haven't done what they wanted me to do." "Yes," he said. "That's what I think too." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that particular quality of attention that still made her feel, every time, like being seen clearly was something approaching remarkable. "You know," he said quietly, "the things that people call difficult about you are the same things that are worth the effort of knowing you." The shop was very quiet. Outside, someone was moving a wagon down the street, and the wheels made a sound on the packed dirt road, and a dog somewhere in the middle distance was expressing itself about something, and inside Nora Kendrick's seamstress shop none of that noise made any impression whatsoever. She said, "That is the most unusual thing anyone has ever said to me." "Is it wrong?" "No," she said. "It's not wrong." Something shifted between them in that moment. Some invisible rearrangement of whatever had been holding them at polite, curious distance. And Nora thought that she had been waiting her whole life for someone to say exactly that. Had been waiting so long that she had stopped believing anyone ever would. And now that it had been said by this quiet, serious, driftwood-eyed man standing in her shop with an armload of mending work, she found that she didn't know entirely what to do with it except feel it very thoroughly. He came back 2 days later, not with mending, but with a book. He set it on the counter without saying anything, and she looked at it, and it was a collection of essays by John Muir about the American wilderness, and she had been wanting to read it for months and hadn't managed to secure a copy. "How did you find this?" she asked. "Webb has a small library," he said. "I asked if he'd mind my borrowing it." "You borrowed it from me. I thought you might enjoy it more than I would right now," he said. "I've been thinking about Huxley more than Muir lately." She held the book in both hands and looked at him and said, with complete sincerity, "Thank you, Peter." He stayed for an hour and a half. They talked about land and the changing nature of the West, and whether the cattle drives would last much longer given the way the railroads were spreading. And he had informed, careful opinions about all of it, and so did she. And they disagreed twice and agreed 3 times, and the conversation went in every direction simultaneously in the way that only the best conversations do. When he left, she went directly to Me's boarding house and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Me, I think I am in love with this man." Me, who had been waiting for this for approximately 6 weeks, set a cup of coffee in front of her and said, "I know, sweetheart. I have known since the harvest dance." "What do I do?" "What you always do," Me said. "Exactly what you think is right." The situation with Curtis Webb's sons came to a head in early November, and it was this that brought everything else to a head as well. The 3 Webb sons, James, who was 35, Robert, who was 32, and the youngest, Dennis, who was 28, had never been reconciled to the idea of their father hiring a foreman from outside the family. They had made trouble for the 2 previous foremen, but those men had been easier to destabilize than Peter Garrison. Peter had a quality of unmovability, not stubbornness exactly, but a kind of rooted steadiness that meant the usual methods undermining authority with the ranch hands, questioning decisions in front of the men, Creating small crises to demonstrate incompetence didn't work, because he handled each situation with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years managing exactly this kind of thing. What they tried next was a direct assault on his reputation in Dusty Creek. James Webb, who drank more than was good for him, had gone into town on a Saturday evening and started talking at the saloon. He told the gathered men that Peter Garrison had cheated their father in the matter of 2 horses, that he had taken payment for animals not worth the price, and that he was, in James's words, not to be trusted with anything more valuable than a fence post. This was a lie, as lies generally were in this type of situation. Nora heard it from me, who heard it from the blacksmith, who had been at the saloon that night. She heard it on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon she had formed a clear and definite opinion about what ought to be done, which was to say so loudly and in public. She was in the general store when she said it, in front of Mr. Hobson and 2 other women and a ranch hand named Williams who worked at a neighboring spread. She said plainly that she had known Peter Garrison to be a man of complete honesty and straight dealing in every interaction she had witnessed, that James Webb was a man with a clear and documented reason for wishing his father's foreman ill, and that anyone with half a grain of sense could evaluate the reliability of that accusation accordingly. The 2 women looked uncomfortable. Williams nodded. Mr. Hobson said, "Miss Kendrick, perhaps that's not your concern." "I beg your pardon," she said, in her very sweetest voice, "but the reputation of a decent man being smeared for the convenience of men who do not want to do their own work is absolutely everyone's concern." She went home and thought nothing more of it until the following afternoon when Peter appeared at her shop door. He did not look like a man who had just had someone defend his honor. He looked like a man who had complicated feelings about that. "I heard what you said at Hobson's," he said. "Good," she said. "Nora, you didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't need to," she said. "I wanted to, it was true." He stepped inside, and the door fell shut behind him, and he stood there in the gray November light that came through her windows looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not quite the controlled stillness he usually wore. It was open in a way that was entirely different, and it cost him something to wear it, she could see, the way certain expressions cost people who were not used to showing their full face. "You said it because it was true," he repeated. "I say things because they're true," she said. "That's generally why." "Nora," he said and stopped. "Peter," she said. "I've been trying to determine," he said, "how to say something to you for about 3 weeks now." "You're not generally without words," she observed. "No," he agreed. "But these particular ones have been—" He paused. "I'm a careful man, I've learned to be. I don't say things I'm not certain of." "I respect that," she said. "I'm certain," he said, "that I have never in my life met anyone like you. I'm certain that every time I leave this shop, I spend the rest of my day thinking about something you said, or something you laughed at, or the way you look when you're working on something difficult, and you get very quiet. I'm certain that difficult is the wrong word for what you are, and that the right word is worth it, and I'm certain that I would like very much to court you properly if you would allow it, and I understand completely if you wouldn't, because you have a full life and you don't need anything from me and Peter," she said. "Yes. Stop talking." He stopped. She set down her needle. She stood up from her workbench. She crossed the short distance between them and she looked up at him, and he was quite a lot taller than she was, which she found she didn't mind even slightly, and she said, "I would very much allow it." He exhaled. It was the single most human sound she had ever heard him make. "I should mention," she said, "that I am exactly as difficult as advertised, and I have no plans to be otherwise." "I know," he said. "That's rather the point," and finally, fully, he smiled. Courting Nora Kendrick was, as Peter later told his brother in a letter, the best and most invigorating challenge of his life. She was not a woman who made things easy, not out of coyness or strategy, but simply because she was genuinely herself at all times, and genuinely herself required engagement at every level. She had opinions about everything about the running of the Double W, which he found enormously useful since she had 26 years of local knowledge he was still acquiring. About the books they both read, which she discussed with the intensity of someone for whom ideas were not merely entertainment but actual nutrition. About the current state of Texas politics, which she found deeply frustrating. About the treatment of the Comanche in the Panhandle region, who had been systematically removed from their lands over the preceding decades, a process she described as a crime committed by people who had written the laws to fit their crimes, and with which observation he entirely agreed. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons, when the week's work was sufficiently settled to allow it. She rode well, which didn't surprise him. She rode the way she did most things, with competence and without flourish. They would ride out onto the open grassland west of town, where the sky was enormous and the wind moved through the tall grass in long, visible waves, and they would talk without the constraint of walls and the possible ears of a town that watched them with the particular attention that Dusty Creek reserved for things it found interesting. He liked, in these rides, seeing her fully relaxed in a way she wasn't quite anywhere else. There was a quality she carried in town, a readiness, as though she were always slightly prepared for someone to say something that required an answer. Out on the grassland, with the enormous Texas sky overhead and nothing in immediate earshot, that readiness eased, and she became something more entirely gentle, more openly full of wonder, pointing out the way the light changed on the grass, and talking about how she had ridden out here as a child when the world had felt too close. He told her things on those rides that he had not told anyone in years. He told her about the brother in California, whose name was Samuel, and who had left after a bitter argument about their father's estate that had never been resolved, and whose last known address in Sacramento was 5 years out of date. He told her about the year he had spent in Colorado, working for a mine operation, and how it had been the worst year of his life not because of the work, but because of the way the land looked there, hemmed in by mountains in a way that made him feel physically constrained, and how the day he had ridden back into the open plain had been like breathing after holding his breath for 12 months. She listened with the same complete attention she gave to everything, and then she said, "Have you written to Samuel?" "Yes," he said, and nothing back. "You'll keep trying," she said, not as a question. "Yes," he said, "I will." "Good," she said simply. He looked at her sideways in the afternoon light, with the grass moving around them and their horses moving together at an unhurried walk, and felt with absolute clarity something he had been examining for months and had now, finally, entirely identified. He was in love with Nora Kendrick. He had been falling in that direction since the first afternoon she had corrected his understanding of why she was direct rather than rude, and now he had arrived there fully and without reservation. He didn't say it yet. He was careful. He wanted to say it correctly and at the correct moment, and with the full weight it deserved. November passed into December, and the cattle drive returned successfully from Abilene, and the Double W was settled for the winter. And Curtis Webb told Peter over supper one evening that he intended to rewrite his will to give the foreman position legal continuity regardless of what his sons might prefer, and that he hoped Peter was planning to stay because he had finally, for the first time in years, felt as though the place was in good hands. James Webb heard about the will, or heard a version of it, and his resentment moved into a new register. It was on a December evening, very cold, with frost on the ground and the light failing early as it did in winter, that James Webb followed Nora home from her shop. She had been working late. She often worked late in December because holiday orders kept her busy, and she was the last person on the main street when she locked up and started walking the 4 blocks to her house. She was not afraid of the dark or the cold, or the walk she had made 1,000 times before, and she was 3 blocks from home before she became aware of the footsteps behind her. She turned around. James Webb stood in the middle of the street, not entirely steady on his feet, and even in the dim light of the cold night she could see the expression on his face was not good. "Miss Kendrick," he said, "I have a message for Peter Garrison." "Deliver it yourself," she said. She kept her voice even and her spine straight and her eyes on him. "You've been causing trouble," he said, "making noise in town about what we said about him, sticking your difficult nose in where it doesn't belong." "The difficulty of my nose," she said, "is entirely a matter of opinion." He moved toward her. She was not a small woman, but he was large and drunk, and there was no one else on the street, and she felt the particular cold clarity that came with genuine danger. What happened next was fast. Peter Garrison came around the corner of the street from the direction of the livery, where he had been returning his horse after a late ride in from the ranch. He took in the situation in the space of about 2 seconds, and his voice, when he spoke, was entirely level. "James." James Webb turned. He was a man who had drunk enough to override his better judgment, but not enough to override his basic sense of self-preservation. And Peter Garrison was not a man whose level voice you mistook for calm. "This isn't your business," James said. "Yes," Peter said, "it is." He crossed to Nora first, positioning himself beside her without touching her. A question in the gesture: was she all right? Did she want him there? She gave him a very small nod that was both answers. "James," he said to the other man, "go home. Sleep. Come find me tomorrow at the ranch when you're clear-headed, and we will have an honest conversation about whatever you think you want from me. But right now you will walk away from this street." James Webb stood for a long moment, and then the alcohol and the cold and whatever remained of his judgment reached some kind of consensus, and he turned and walked. He did not look graceful about it. The silence that followed was the specific kind that comes after something might have happened and didn't. "Are you all right?" Peter asked her, and she turned to look at him, and his face in the cold blue-black night was full of a feeling he wasn't bothering to conceal, and it struck her like a bell being struck, the genuine depth of what was written there. "I'm fine," she said. "I was managing." "I know you were," he said. "I know you can, He stopped. "You just what?" she asked. "I just needed to be here," he said, and it was simple and complete and entirely without any suggestion that she had needed saving, only that he had needed the being present, and the distinction was the whole world. They stood in the winter cold, and then he said, "Let me walk you home." She said, "Yes." They walked the last block in silence, and at her door in the cold dark with frost on the wooden steps he said, "Nora." "Yes," she said, and she was smiling because she already knew what was coming, could feel it in the quality of the cold around them, could feel it in the way this whole evening, this whole autumn had been building toward this. "I love you," he said. It was said the way he said most things, without unnecessary preamble, with full weight, with total honesty. "I wanted to say it correctly, and I don't have anything more elaborate than that. I love you, that's all of it." She breathed out, and her breath made a small cloud in the cold December air, and she said, "I love you, Peter Garrison. I love you, and I have been managing the fact of it for the better part of 3 months, and I am very tired of managing it." He took her face in both his hands, very carefully, the way he handled things that mattered, and kissed her. It was, she thought afterward, a kiss that tasted like arriving somewhere you'd been on your way to for a long time without quite knowing it. Not a beginning so much as a recognition. She went inside and stood in her small, warm house full of books and fabric, and laughed softly in the dark because she could not help it. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a long one, and it was also, Nora thought later, the most beautiful winter of her life. She had never understood before what people meant when they said they were happy. She had always found the word too small and too easily applied to things that didn't deserve it. What she felt now was not small. It was large and specific and slightly frightening in its completeness, and she examined it regularly to make sure it was real, which it persistently and stubbornly was. Peter was a different person in love than she had expected. She had expected from his care and his stillness and his precise way of saying things a romantic reserve, a person who loved practically and without extravagance. And he was that, in some ways. But he also left small tokens on her windowsill when he came to town early in the morning before she was up. once a smooth river stone of an unusual green, once a single dried wildflower that still held its color, once a folded piece of paper with a line from the Shakespeare play he kept in his saddlebag written out in his careful hand. She kept all of them. She left things for him too, in her own way. She made him a new shirt, a good one, with careful stitching at every stress point so it would last, and she left it on his chair at the boarding house the day before a hard drive he was taking north without any note because it didn't need one. She bookmarked pages she thought he would care about. She learned from me what he ate for breakfast and made sure the morning he came in after a particularly brutal week that there was a meal waiting at me's kitchen table that was exactly that. He noticed all of it. He was the kind of man who noticed. They had their first genuine argument in January over the situation with the Webb sons. Peter had gone to Curtis Webb and laid out the situation plainly. That James's behavior was escalating, that it was creating problems at the ranch and potentially dangerous situations elsewhere, and that he needed Curtis to make a clear decision about whether his family's desire to undermine the foreman was something he intended to tolerate. Curtis Webb, who was genuinely ailing now and spending more days in bed than out, had told James and Robert and Dennis in no uncertain terms that Peter Garrison had his complete authority, and that anyone who threatened or harassed the man or anyone connected to him would find themselves no longer welcome on the Double W. It was a decisive action, and it worked. James Webb, stripped of his audience and his leverage, retreated into a sullen compliance that was not pleasant but was manageable. The problem, as Nora saw it, was that Peter had handled the situation without telling her he was going to do it, and she had heard about it secondhand from me, who had heard it from Williams, who had been present at the Webb family meeting. She told Peter this directly. She said that she understood why he had done it, and she agreed that it had been the right thing and she was glad of it, but she needed him to understand that she was not a person who could be protected from information about things that directly concerned her. She needed to know what was happening in her own life. She could not be part of something that required her ignorance. He listened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You're right. I wasn't trying to protect you from the information. I was moving quickly and I didn't think to stop and tell you first. That was wrong of me and I apologize. It was so simple." No defense, no diminishing of her concern, no suggestion that she was overreacting, just a clean acknowledgement and a direct apology. She stared at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. Most people don't what? Apologize when they've done something wrong." "Not in my experience, no," she said. He shook his head. "Well," he said, "that speaks to the quality of their character, not to what's normal." Their argument, such as it had been, was resolved in approximately 20 minutes. Me, who had been certain it would take at least a week, expressed deep disappointment that she had nothing to report. February came, and with it a particular evening that Nora would remember for the rest of her life. Peter came to her house on a Sunday evening, which he did regularly now. They had fallen into a pattern of Sunday evenings at her house, where she cooked because she was an excellent cook, and she enjoyed it, and he helped in the ways she directed and ate with sincere appreciation. And afterward they sat by the small fire and talked or read in the comfortable silence of people who had become accustomed to each other's company without losing their interest in it. He came in from the cold and she had supper ready, and they ate together with the fire crackling and the winter dark solid beyond the windows. After supper he helped her clear the table, as he always did, and she turned around from the worktop, and he was standing in the middle of her kitchen looking at her with an expression that was entirely different from any she had seen on his face. He was nervous. Peter Garrison, who was never nervous, was nervous. She set down the cloth she was holding. He put his hand in his vest pocket and removed a ring. It was a simple thing, a thin gold band with a small setting of turquoise, the kind of stone that had been worked by the local craftsmen in the region and that the traders brought through twice a year. It was exactly the kind of ring she would have chosen for herself. She had no idea how he had known that. "I have been thinking," he said, about how to do this correctly, and I have concluded that correctly for you means directly. So, he crossed to her, and he held the ring, and he said, "Nora Kendrick, you are the most complete person I have ever known, and I would like to spend my entire life in conversation with you. I would like to build something with you that is as honest and as sturdy as you are. I would like to be the man who is worthy of the effort of knowing you, and I believe I understand at least somewhat what that effort involves. Will you marry me?" The fire crackled. Outside, the February wind pressed against the walls of the house. "Yes," she said, without a single reservation. He put the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly, and she held his face in both hands and kissed him with all the considerable force of a woman who had been waiting her whole life for someone to see her fully and still want to stay, and he kissed her back the same way, which was the only way that would have been adequate. The town of Dusty Creek was, predictably, agitated. Some people were pleased. Mee was so visibly delighted she was practically incandescent, and Mr. Hobson at the general store offered congratulations and a small discount on her next fabric order. Others were skeptical Mrs. Caldwell told 3 separate people that she gave it 6 months, which was less a prediction than a wish. Roy Hale, to his credit and Nora's genuine respect, came to her shop the following week, removed his hat and said, "I wish you both happiness, Nora, I mean that." "Thank you, Roy," she said. "I mean that too." James Webb, stripped of both purpose and audience, had by this point retreated almost entirely from town life and was reportedly working a homestead claim of his own to the south. Robert and Dennis, with their father's health continuing to decline, were gradually being brought into the management of the Double W in a limited, supervised capacity that Peter was carefully overseeing. They were married in April. The ceremony was small because both of them wanted it that way, small and honest, with no performance and no guests who weren't genuinely glad to be there. Mee was Nora's attendant. Williams from the neighboring ranch stood with Peter, which surprised the town slightly because Williams was a Mexican-American man who had worked the range for 15 years and was not the kind of man that Dusty Creek's social conventions usually elevated to such a position. And Peter had not thought about this for more than half a second before asking him, because Williams was his friend and a good man, and that was the only consideration. The preacher read the ceremony efficiently, if not entirely warmly. He and Mrs. Caldwell both wore expressions of neutral officiousness. And then it was done, and Peter and Nora Garrison walked back down the aisle of the church in the April sunshine that came through the tall windows, and she held his arm, and she was wearing a dress she had made herself, the finest work of her seamstress career, a cream-colored thing with tiny, precise embroidery at the cuffs and collar, and he was wearing a suit that she had insisted on making him, and that fit as suits rarely fit working men. And they were entirely themselves, and entirely married and entirely happy in the uncomplicated, complete way that neither of them had ever expected to be. Mee's boarding house was the venue for the small reception, and Mee had cooked enough food for 3 times the number of people present, which was precisely Mee's way of expressing affection. Williams had brought his guitar. The evening went long and warm and full of laughter, and when Nora and Peter finally walked home through the spring night to the house that was now theirs together, they had agreed she would stay in the house she had built her life in, and he would move his few things in from the boarding house, and they had made space for each other in every corner of it. She felt the particular fullness of a day that had been exactly what it was meant to be. He had moved his books onto her shelves, and the sight of them mixed together, his and hers, was one of the most quietly beautiful things she had ever seen. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that teaches you things. They learned, in detail, what it meant to live with each other's full dimensions, not the Sunday evening and Sunday ride versions of each other, but the every single morning and every single night and every day between versions. Peter was methodical in the early morning in a way that she found both admirable and extremely early, as she was not a morning person and had never pretended otherwise. She, in turn, could work at her bench in a focused silence that went on for hours without her requiring any interaction, which he found entirely compatible with his own way of being. They argued about real things, and they resolved them, and neither of them was the kind of person who let things fester unspoken. She got a small cat sometime in June, an orange one who arrived at the back door and declined to leave, and she named it Huxley, and Peter pretended to be indifferent to it for approximately 2 weeks before she caught him sharing a piece of his supper with it under the kitchen table. Curtis Webb died in August of that year. It was not unexpected. He had been declining all year with the steady quiet of a man who had done what he meant to do and was now putting down the work. He died on a Wednesday morning with his sons gathered around him, and he had made his peace with all 3 of them, which Peter said was more than could be expected, and perhaps more than any of them deserved. He left the double W to his sons, as was natural, but with provisions in the will that made Peter Garrison's position as foreman contractually secure for a period of 10 years, which was Curtis's final practical act, and which Peter received with the quiet grief of a man who understood what it meant. The letter from Samuel came in October. It came through the Postal Service from Sacramento, addressed to Peter Garrison, care of Dusty Creek, Texas, and it was long 4 pages in a cramped, apologetic hand. Peter read it alone first, and then he came to Nora and read it again with her, and she sat beside him at the kitchen table and did not say anything for a long time after, and then she took his hand and held it, and he held hers back. Samuel was alive. Samuel had a wife and a son and was working in the lumber trade. Samuel was sorry. He said it 6 different times in 6 different ways, and none of them were quite adequate, and all of them were genuine. Peter wrote back that same evening, 4 pages of his own in the careful, precise handwriting she loved, and she watched him write it, and occasionally he looked up and she nodded, and when he was finished she read it over and said, "This is perfect." He sent it. Samuel replied. A correspondence was established, and it grew, and the following year Samuel's wife sent a small gift for the baby, because by the following year there was a baby. Nora had known before she told Peter, in the way that women know things before they are entirely confirmed, and she had sat with it for a week before telling him, needing the time to find her own relationship with the news before sharing it. She told him on a Sunday evening after supper, with the fire going and Huxley the cat arranged on the chair nearby, and she said simply that she thought they were going to have a child. He was very still for a moment, the way he went still when something mattered enormously, and then he took a breath and his face did something that she had never seen it do before, which was open completely, not just his expression but some deeper layer, something unguarded and full of joy. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well." He came and sat beside her on the small sofa that had been her father's, which she had kept all these years, and he put his arms around her with great care, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the firelight for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing to say that was more complete than what was already there. The pregnancy was, in Nora's honest assessment, not a comfortable experience. She was not the kind of woman who suffered quietly, and she said so directly, and Peter, to his enormous credit, never once suggested she ought to be otherwise. He adjusted things, practical things. He took on more of the household work without being asked. He rode to the double W and back more quickly so as not to be away long. He learned what helped and what didn't and applied that knowledge without drama. The women in town were both more and less helpful than Nora expected. Mrs. Caldwell showed up with a jar of preserved peaches and no commentary whatsoever, which Nora counted as a significant event. Me came every week and was me, which was to say invaluable. There was a woman named Clara Rojas who was married to Williams the ranch hand and who had 3 children of her own, and she became, in this period, something of a new friend to Nora. A woman who was direct and funny and knowledgeable and entirely unintimidated by Nora's personality, which Nora found deeply refreshing. Their son was born in the first week of May 1884, in the house on the edge of town, and they named him Thomas, for Nora's father, and his middle name was James, for Peter's father. And he was a healthy, loud, demanding child who arrived with tremendous force, and immediately set about establishing himself as the most important thing in any room, which both his parents found simultaneously exhausting and magnificent. Nora, who had spent her whole life being told that her way of being was too much, held her son in the first hour after his birth, and felt the particular revolution that is watching something you love exist completely on its own terms, and thought that she would spend every day of her life making sure he knew that being exactly himself was enough. Peter sat beside her that whole first day, and she watched him hold Thomas, who was tiny in his large, careful hands, and she saw the same thing in his face that she had seen the evening she told him, that complete openness, that unguarded joy, and she thought that she had been right on that December night 2 years ago, when she had understood that the look on his face was the whole world. The years that followed built on each other the way good years do, not without difficulty, because nothing without difficulty is worth much, but with the kind of accumulated richness that comes from two people who are genuinely engaged with both each other and with life. Dusty Creek changed around them, as the West was changing everywhere in those years. The cattle drives that had defined the town's economy were indeed fading, just as Peter had predicted, as the railroads pushed further into the territory and the need for the long trail north diminished. The range that had been open grassland through Nora's childhood was increasingly fenced, divided, claimed, contested, all the complex and often unjust reshaping of land that the expanding nation was conducting across the whole enormous western frontier. Peter navigated these changes at the Double W with the same steady intelligence he brought to everything, adapting operations, diversifying what the ranch raised and produced, developing relationships with the new railroad buyers that allowed the Webb Ranch to transition without catastrophe. Robert and Dennis Webb, who had initially been so like their brother James, turned out to be, once James was no longer around to stoke their worst impulses, reasonably competent men who respected Peter's guidance more than they admitted. The Double W stabilized and then grew. Nora's shop changed too. She took on an apprentice, a girl named Helen, 17 years old, daughter of a homesteader family, with nimble hands and a quick mind, and a fierce desire to learn a trade that would give her economic independence. And Nora recognized in her a version of her own younger self and taught her with total seriousness and complete frankness about the business end of things, which was as important as the craft. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic boy who had his father's gray-brown eyes and his mother's comprehensive opinions about everything, which combination Peter said was simultaneously the best possible outcome and a reliable source of exhaustion. He loved the ranch with a passion that Peter quietly encouraged, taking him out to the Double W on weekends and teaching him the language of cattle and land and horses in the same patient way he did everything. When Thomas was 3, Nora became pregnant again. This time it was easier, not easy, but easier, and she worked at the bench until 2 weeks before the birth, which caused both me and Clara to express concern and Nora to tell them both that she appreciated their worry and would absolutely call for help if she needed it, and that needlework was not physically strenuous, and that furthermore she had orders to complete. Their daughter came in February of 1887, in the same house, attended by the same doctor and me, while Peter sat in the front room with Thomas asleep on his lap and waited through the longest night of his life. She was named Me. For obvious reasons, Me Briggs cried and protested and eventually admitted she was enormously pleased, and her second name was Clara, and Me Clara Garrison arrived with the deep lungs and immediate strong opinions that seemed to run in her family on both sides. Peter, holding her for the first time, said quietly, "She looks determined." "Of course she does," Nora said. He looked up. "She has your eyes." "Then she'll be trouble," Nora said and smiled. "I hope so," he said, with complete sincerity. The letter from Samuel arrived that same spring with the news that Samuel and his wife were coming east. Business interests had drawn him to Texas, and he wanted to meet his brother's family. Nora had been corresponding with Samuel's wife, a woman named Grace, for 2 years now, and there was a genuine anticipation to the visit that included some of Nora's characteristic practical nervousness, the kind she felt when things mattered enough that she wanted them to go right. They arrived in June, Samuel and Grace and their son William, who was 8 years old and immediately fell into intense and complicated friendship with Thomas, who was 4, in the way that children do when they have complementary temperaments. Samuel Garrison was similar to Peter in the way that brothers are similar, recognizable, but with a different balance of the same elements. And he was clearly a man who carried guilt about the long silence, and equally clearly a man who was working through it with genuine effort. The 5 days they spent in Dusty Creek were the kind of visit that changes things. Peter and Samuel talked for a long time on the second day, out on the porch in the evening, and Nora did not listen. It wasn't hers to hear, but she watched Peter's face afterward and saw something in it that had been quietly absent before, a settled thing, a closed thing, a small old wound finally laid to rest. She made them her best dinner both nights they ate at the house. She showed Grace the shop, which Grace admired with the genuine appreciation of someone who understood craft. They stood over the sleeping babies together. Me was 3 months old and William was entranced by her, and Grace said, "Peter's letters about you are the best letters he writes. They always have been." "What does he say?" Nora asked. Grace smiled. "He says you are the most interesting and honest person he has ever known. He says that before you, he thought he understood what it meant to feel at home, but he hadn't yet." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Tell him I said the same," she said. The visit ended and Samuel and Grace went south and then, eventually west again. But the correspondence continued, and now it was no longer the careful, slightly formal letters of a reconnection, but the comfortable, detailed letters of a family. The autumn of 1887 brought a hard season, a drought that settled over the Panhandle with unusual severity, the kind that emptied water tanks and killed grass and drove cattle to the edges of remaining water sources in struggling clusters. Peter worked harder that fall than in any season she had known, and she saw him tired in ways that the work alone didn't account for, tired in the way of watching something you've built threatened by forces you can't negotiate with or plan around, the pure difficulty of a drought that simply would not end. She made him eat. She made him sleep. She argued with him when he was going to push too hard, and she was right, and he knew she was right, and he went to bed. She did not spare him the plain truth about what she observed, that he was running on insufficient fuel, and that exhausted men made mistakes, and he received it with the same honest engagement he brought to everything she said. The drought broke in November, and the relief was palpable across the whole region. The Double W had survived with less loss than most, because Peter had managed the water resources carefully and moved cattle at the right times, and the Webb brothers acknowledged this grudgingly, and with the specific tone of men who were grateful but found gratitude difficult. Peter came home the evening the rain started, soaking wet and grinning in the way he rarely grinned, broadly, unself-consciously, like a young man. And Thomas met him at the door and he picked the boy up and swung him, which Thomas received with enormous enthusiasm, and which baby me observed from her blanket with an expression of considerable skepticism. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her family and felt something so complete that it almost hurt. He put Thomas down and came to her, and he was still wet from the rain, and he kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth because he was soaking her dress, and he laughed back, and Thomas ran between them shouting something about the rain, And from the blanket, me had moved on from skepticism to enthusiasm and was making her opinions on the ruckus quite vocal. "I love you," he said, still laughing. "I know," she said. "I love you back. Go change your wet clothes before you flood my kitchen." He went, still grinning, and she went back to the stove. And Huxley, the orange cat, now 6 years old and magnificently indifferent to all weather events, watched from his chair as though this entire human drama was far beneath his attention. The years moved forward the way good years move, not without loss, because loss was part of living, and not without difficulty, because difficulty was part of anything real, but with a through line of genuine fullness that Nora had not believed once was something her life would hold. Helen, her apprentice, completed her training and opened her own seamstress shop in the neighboring town of Mercer, and Nora was so proud of her that she made her a complete set of professional tools as a parting gift, and pressed money on her for the first month's lease, and told her that she was going to be extraordinary. And Helen cried and hugged her and said she wanted to grow up to be Nora, and Nora told her no, that she should grow up to be Helen, which was considerably better. She took on a new apprentice after that, a young man this time, a 14-year-old whose name was Oscar, and who had a gift for the work that was immediately evident, and who was sent to her by his widowed mother with the hope that he might learn a trade. And Nora taught him the same way she had taught Helen, with total seriousness and complete information and high expectations that she expressed with clarity rather than pressure. Thomas grew up. This was not surprising, and yet Nora found it consistently astonishing, the way her son grew from the loud, demanding baby into the serious, curious boy into the young man who at 15 was already as tall as his father and who had, unmistakably, inherited the best things from both of them, Peter's steadiness and Nora's ferocity, and who was almost certainly going to be, as Peter said one evening with great serenity, a great deal of trouble in the most excellent way possible. Me grew up differently, as a second child does, having had the benefit of watching everything from a position of observation before launching herself at it. She had Peter's quietness and Nora's precision and a wit that was entirely her own, and from the time she could manage needle and thread, she had shown an interest in the shop that Nora recognized and honored but did not push, because the shop was hers to offer but the choice had to be me's to make. At 9 years old, me told her mother plainly that she wanted to learn the trade. "Why?" Nora asked. Me considered. "Because you're good at it and you like it," she said, "and I want to be good at something I like." Nora taught her daughter with the same care she brought to everything, and found that teaching me was one of the most interesting things she had ever done, because me learned differently than her apprentices had. Me had a kind of intuitive spatial understanding that made pattern work come naturally to her, combined with Nora's own precision, and within 2 years she was producing work that was not remedial but genuinely good. In 1892, Dusty Creek was incorporated into the county system and got a proper courthouse and a new school building, and the following year a telegraph line ran through town, and the year after that, the pace of change was such that the Dusty Creek of Nora's childhood was becoming something else entirely, not better or worse precisely, but different, the old roughness smoothing into something more structured. Peter and Nora sat on their porch one August evening. The children were inside. Thomas was 17 and me was 13, and both of them were occupied with their own worlds, and watched the stars come out over the Texas sky in the same thick, brilliant way they always had, the one thing that hadn't changed. "Are you happy?" he asked her. Not anxiously, the way some people ask that question, as though happiness were something that could be lost, and the question was actually a search for reassurance. He asked it the way he asked everything, directly and genuinely curious about the true answer. "Profoundly," she said. "Profoundly," he repeated, and she could hear the smile in it. "I was thinking," she said, "about Roy Hale." "Were you?" He was amused. "He called me difficult," she said. He meant it as the worst thing, as though being difficult was the same as being broken. "What do you think it means now?" he asked. She thought about it. She thought about the girl she had been, sharp-edged and certain and alone with the fullness of herself in a world that kept trying to sand her down. She thought about the woman she had become, still sharp-edged, still certain, still fully herself, but no longer alone with it. She thought about everything that fullness had built and created and raised. "I think it means worth the effort," she said. "I think it always did." He took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand for 10 years, and held it in the way that was so familiar it was itself a language, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the August stars burned above the Texas plain in their thousands. "Yes," he said quietly, "that's exactly what it means." The years kept adding themselves, as years insist on doing. Thomas, at 19, made the announcement that Nora had privately been expecting for 2 years. He wanted to work the land, but not the double W, not as his father's connection, but his own. He had been saving for 2 years from work he'd done at the ranch and from odd jobs in town, and he had an eye on a piece of land to the west of Dusty Creek, old homestead land that had come available. Peter and Nora sat with him at the kitchen table on a December evening, and Thomas laid out his plans with a thoroughness that told Nora he had been thinking about this very carefully. And Peter asked him the practical questions, the hard questions about water rights and capital and market access. And Thomas had answers to most of them and honest acknowledgement when he didn't. And at the end, Peter looked at Nora and Nora looked at Peter, and then they both looked at their son. "We'll put in some money," Nora said. "Not a gift, a loan with a proper interest rate because you need to know the cost of capital." Thomas looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone who had expected resistance and was recalibrating around its absence. "That's all. We trust you," Peter said simply. Thomas looked at his father for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, and there was more in it than 2 words usually carried. He bought the land in January. By spring he had a functioning homestead and a sturdy if modest house, and he was spending every possible hour on his land with a focus and energy that Nora recognized as entirely his own, entirely real. Me, in the meantime, had become, at 16, genuinely accomplished at the trade in a way that went beyond what Nora had taught her. She had developed a particular approach to pattern design that combined practicality with an elegance that Nora couldn't take credit for. It was me's own aesthetic, me's own eye. Nora had the distinct and somewhat humbling experience of watching her daughter surpass her in certain specific technical aspects of the work, and she found this not diminishing but enormously gratifying. "You're better at this part than I am," she told me one afternoon, holding up a sleeve that me had set with a fineness of technique that was beyond Nora's own. Me looked at her. "That's because you taught me properly," she said. "No," Nora said. "That's because you're gifted and you worked hard. Don't give me credit for what's yours." Me was quiet for a moment. "You sound like Papa," she said. "Thank you," Nora said. "That's the best compliment you could give me." Spring of 1895 arrived with the particular sweetness that comes after a hard winter. The Double W was stable. The new decade was bringing changes to Dusty Creek that were mostly good. A larger school, a small hospital at last, families settling and building the kind of community that looked less like a rough frontier town and more like a place people intended to stay. On a Saturday in April, Nora walked the length of the main street of Dusty Creek and saw, in the same way that you sometimes see a place you've always known with sudden clarity, what it had become and what it still was. The wooden boardwalks were still there, still cracking in the summer heat as they always had. The general store where Mr. Hobson had set books aside for her, he had retired now. His son ran the place was still on the corner. Her shop was still where it had always been, though it was larger now, expanded twice in 20 years. She went back to it, her shop, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it with the shop owner's particular knowledge of every flaw and every good thing. She had built this. She had built it alone first, and then she had built it in company, and it was a real thing in the world that had not existed before she made it. Peter appeared at the end of the street on Cass. Cass was 13 now, still sound, still moving with that distinctive even rhythm she had learned to recognize before she knew she was listening. He rode toward her and pulled up at the hitching post outside the shop, and she watched him dismount with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and he turned and saw her in the doorway and smiled. That smile. 13 years of it, and it still did the same thing to her. "What are you standing there looking at?" he asked. "Everything," she said. He came up onto the boardwalk and stood beside her and looked where she was looking down the length of the street, the town, the big Texas sky over it all. "It's a good town," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It's a hard town sometimes, but it's good. Are you ready to go home?" She took his arm. "Yes," she said. They walked home together through the April afternoon, through a town that knew them, past buildings they had watched change and people they had watched grow up in places where things had happened that had mattered. They passed the spot where he had walked toward her on that cold December night a long time ago, and she glanced at it as she always did, not sentimentally but with the specific acknowledgement of someone who knows where things began. At the house, Me was in the shop window. They had opened a connecting door years ago, when the expanded space allowed it, working on a commission that she took visible pleasure in. Thomas would come for Sunday supper tomorrow, as he did every week, and he would bring the latest news from his land with the enthusiasm of someone deeply in love with what he was doing. Clara Garrison at 18 was her own complete world, certain and precise and funny, and so genuinely herself that Nora sometimes looked at her and felt the particular joy of recognizing something you'd hoped for and gotten exactly right. Nora stood in the kitchen of her house, her father's house, her family's house, and made coffee, and Peter came in and leaned against the doorframe in the way he had leaned against doorframes since the beginning, and watched her with the specific quality of attention that had not diminished in 13 years. "What?" she said without turning around. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking at you." "You have been just looking at me for 13 years. "Yes," he said. "It continues to hold my interest." She turned around. He was smiling, and his hair was grayer than it had been when she met him, and he was 43 years old and still had those driftwood eyes, and she was 39 and still wore her hair up in the same practical knot, and they were entirely themselves and entirely each other's, and it was the most complete thing she had ever known. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him because she wanted to, and he kissed her back because he always did, and from the front of the house they could hear Me starting to sing to herself as she worked, something low and pleasant that drifted through the connecting door. "I was the most difficult woman west of the Mississippi," Nora said against his shoulder. "You still are," he said. "It remains, in my opinion, the absolute best thing about you." She laughed. Outside the window, the spring afternoon was gold and warm over the Texas plain, and the town of Dusty Creek moved through its daily life with all the noise and necessity of a living place, and the sky above it was as enormous and brilliant as it had always been, the one constant thing in a world that kept changing. "Worth the effort?" she asked. He tightened his arms around her. "Every single day of my life," he said. "Without exception, without reservation, every single day." She held him with all the certainty of a woman who had spent her whole life being exactly herself, no more and no less, and had found at last that exactly herself was exactly enough. More than enough. The whole impossible, beautiful, difficult, worth it thing. Thomas came for supper the next day and told them over the table that he had met a woman, a schoolteacher named Ruth, who ran the new school, and who was apparently as direct and serious-minded as Thomas himself, and Me made a sound of tremendous satisfaction because she had predicted this, and Peter asked the right questions. And Nora sat at the head of her table in the house her father had built and watched her family gathered around it, and felt the entire weight and worth of everything that had been built. Later that night, with the house quiet and the stars out in their thousands over the Texas sky, Peter and Nora sat on the porch the way they had been sitting on porches together for 13 years, his hand in hers, and she looked at the stars and felt, in the full quiet of a life that was entirely her own and entirely shared and entirely alive, the deep, unhurried gratitude of someone who had bet on herself and been right. Difficult. She had been called it her whole life. She had worn it like an accusation, deflected it like an attack, and slowly, over the years, learned to wear it for what it actually was. The name that small people gave to things they couldn't hold. And she had been held, finally and completely, by the one man who had understood from the beginning that difficult was not the obstacle. Difficult was the whole point. It was the point and the prize and the reason, and she pressed her shoulder against his in the dark, and he pressed back, and they sat together under the wild Texas sky in the good silence of two people who had found each other and known what they found and chosen it, every day, for all the days that they had.